So right now they can.
Yeah. Okay, I think some of you can maybe see us. Can we say from where we are, it's good afternoon. But hello and welcome, whichever part of the world you're watching from. We're really, really pleased that you've joined us this afternoon. You'll maybe recognise me from the videos and things that you've been watching this week. I'm Margaret Sutherland, and we're sitting here in the University of Glasgow in Scotland, which is one of the 4 countries that makes up the United Kingdom, along with England, Wales, Northern Ireland. So it's really good that you have joined us this week on the course, and great that you've been able to join us today online as well. We're just going to wait for another couple of minutes. It's not quite 2:30 here in the UK yet, and there may be some people that are going to join us. But we'd be really pleased if you would like to start and type any questions you have. We have some already that we'll try to discuss and think through, but it would be good if you have anything that you'd like to say, or even just say hello to us. That would be great to hear from you in the next few minutes before we kind of officially start our, and certainly our first ever Google Hangout. We can see a few more people have joined us. It's great to have you with us. We're just waiting just a couple of minutes past, or 30 minutes past until we start officially. But as I say, please send us your questions, comments, or even just say hello to us. It's really good to have you join us this afternoon. Well, we have somebody from Brazil saying hello. It's good to have you with us. Great to see that coming in. And we're nearly there. We'll just get started. This is a first time for us, so we're just been learning our way around the system. Hi from somebody else. Good to see you there too. And we're just working out how to best manage our first Google Hangout. I think we've both been, or all 3 of us have been both excited about this and a little bit nervous and anxious. So we're glad to have you join us, and hopefully it will be a good experience for all of us to have been able to chat this afternoon.
That's fine.
Okay, I think we're ready to get started. As I say, it's really good to have you join us this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are. And we were very aware that some of the comments on the Start the Date page were people saying that, oh, I'm working, or oh, it's the middle of the night. And to be honest, we sat and we discussed what time to have this Google Hangout, and we had to fit it in around other teaching commitments that we have here in the university. And also we were aware that actually whichever time we picked, it would be a different time somewhere else for people. And so we've gone with this time on the Friday afternoon this week, Friday afternoon next week, and then the Thursday of the following week, because the end of that, the third week of our course is actually a holiday on the Friday for us. We will be on holiday, so we wouldn't be able to be here with you. So we've made it for the day before. So it's been great. One of the great things about this has been that people from all over the world have joined us. And so I know for some of you it's the weekend, and that's great. For others, it's work time, and maybe you're watching this later on YouTube. But however you're watching it, whether it's live or whether it's after the event, we're pleased that you've joined us, and we hope that we will all learn something from the discussion. So my name is Margaret. As you know, I'm sure you've seen me already in some of the videos, and I work here at the University of Glasgow, based in Scotland. And as I was saying, Scotland's one of the 4 countries that makes up the UK. And I've been really, really privileged to work with some great people as we've been pulling this course together. Our technical people, John and Craig, have just been wonderful. We couldn't have done any of this without them. And then I have 2 colleagues sitting here with me, and we've been kind of shifting chairs so we can all make sure we fit in the picture. But I'm going to hand over to them just to say hello, who they are, and just say how they've enjoyed being with you this week. So, Kasia.
Hi everyone. My name is Kasia. Probably you've seen me around joining some of your discussion. I'm really excited to be a part of this course, and I cannot wait for the next week to see what you have to say about your own practice and your own context. So welcome, and it's lovely to be with you here.
And
Hi.
Also, I have with us our other colleague, Podria. Podria, would you like to say hello to?
Hi everybody. It's very nice to join you this course. It's very nice, and I'm very happy to be with you.
It's been great as we've worked together, both pulling the course together and then also together reading your comments. It's been really, it's kind of almost surpassed what we hoped it would be like. It's just been great. And I think the first thing that's really impressed us is the commitment of all of you to education, and particularly to the education of those who are marginalised and excluded. And I think there's a recognition from all of us that this is not easy, that they're very difficult things that we're talking about, and that there is no one kind of magic answer that's going to sort this problem overnight. But I think we do all think there are things we can do. There are things we can do that will make learning better for all young people. And I think it's been really good to see the range of nationalities and countries represented, and to see you share and discuss and also support each other. Some of you asked questions, and it wasn't one of us that came on and suggested something, but it was amongst yourselves. And I think that kind of learning is really empowering too. So that's just been great to see. We're very conscious that all 3 of us are sitting here in Glasgow, in Scotland. We have very different experiences. We are all in the same country now, but we didn't all start in the same country. And that's been useful because we've been able to share ideas about what education looks like in different cultures and different countries. But there's an agreement that some of the big issues that we're discussing are just big issues. And it's been really encouraging for us to see that that's kind of what a lot of you were saying too, saying, I hadn't really thought about that in my country, but now you mention it, yeah, that is a big issue. And our countries look different. we have to say that we do get quite a lot of rain here in Scotland. It's a very green country, a very beautiful country because of that. But there are other countries represented here where the sun shines much more. So there are physical differences in our countries, there's cultural differences, there's legislative differences. But the other thing that we all have in our countries are young people. And young people are young people, and I know that I can see from your comments that you enjoy working with them as much as all of we do here. So as I say, this is our first experience of a Google Hangout, so we're hoping we kind of get the hang of it and that we perhaps get better as the weeks go on. But we asked you to post questions, and we're going to try and discuss those and share some of our ideas and thoughts around those questions. I did notice though that somebody had said, I think at the end of this week, I've got more questions than answers, more questions than even when I started. And do you know something? Well, I think maybe that's okay. I think it's good to have questions. I think it's good to ask questions and to ask hard questions too. When we are working here with our student teachers and with our teachers, indeed with pupils as well, we talk about kind of asking the question and then coming down into almost a kind of pit of despair and despondency as you try to work out an answer, and then coming back out of that with some kind of answer. And one of the things that happens sometimes is you actually come out not just with an answer to that question, but you actually come out saying, that might have been not quite the right question. Maybe I actually need to rephrase or rethink the question too. So there will perhaps be one answer to any of the questions that we pose on this course, but we do hope that together we can start to explore some of the issues and then within ourselves come to some kind of answer that is appropriate for where we are, for the young people we work with, whether it be our own family, and I know some of you that have joined as our parents, or whether it be in a school context, or whether you're in fact maybe a policy maker, whatever. We need to make our answers work for us wherever we are. So we'll get started. I have a little list here of all the questions. I can see somebody has already posted a question, and that's great. And one of the things Kasia and Podria are going to do during this session is to kind of pick up on these questions and make sure that they feed into this bigger discussion. But somebody asked, they asked it in a particular context. They asked about the current UK curriculum and why is it turning off so many learners. And we will deal actually with curriculum much more in week 2, and then also touch on it again in week 3 when we start to think about in a kind of very practical sense of what we do. Such about curriculum, but I thought it was a really interesting question. And in fact, on Wednesday, I was talking along with a couple of colleagues, another colleague from here in Glasgow, somebody from Cardiff in Wales, and also from a colleague in Tanzania. And we were talking about a particular group of learners in Tanzania. And we actually ended up talking about this very issue, about curriculum and relevance. And I think it is one of these questions that does cover the whole world. It's not a culturally bound question in a sense. And it is this notion, I think, of relevance. The person who asked the question was talking about the fact that they work with young people who are travelling, part of the travelling community, and that they weren't terribly engaged at times, and yet they had offered them an opportunity to decide what they wanted to learn about. And when they had that opportunity, they became really engaged. So these young people were able to engage in education, but at times were choosing not to engage in education. And that kind of issue of engagement, I think, is one that we perhaps, wherever we are, we struggle with. I think parents sometimes struggle with it too, and certainly in the context we were talking about on Wednesday in relation to Tanzania, we were saying, talking about the fact that some parents say, well, you know, why would we send you to school? You're going to work here in the village, in the shamba, and what you go and learn is perhaps not going to be immediately relevant to where you're coming back to. So I think the issue of relevance around curriculum is quite important. And I think, as I say, we will touch on that much more when we come into the second week. So we'll maybe revisit that question next week when we've thought more about curriculum. But just one other example that I might share with you around relevance. I had the privilege of listening to a lady who worked in Egypt. And she was here in Glasgow and she ran a seminar for us. And she told us a story of, she was working with some of the street children in Egypt. And the children there didn't read. They were by and large illiterate. And one of the things they did to survive was to sort out the rubbish, the recycling. And they were sorting out the plastic bottles. And some of the plastic bottles earned them more money than some of the other plastic bottles. And she suddenly thought, I wonder if I could teach them to read the labels on the bottles, because if they could read the labels, they would be able to recycle better. So in a sense, she was giving them a purpose for their reading, because they hadn't engaged in school. They hadn't had a lot of opportunity to engage in school. So through learning to read the labels, in order to become better recyclers, they learned to read. And of course, many of these children suddenly realized it's not just the bottle that I can read, but I can read the street sign, I can read the newspaper, I can read all kinds of things. And she had some wonderful stories of young people who had been living on the street, who learned to read for a purpose that was helping them in terms of making a living. And some of these young people had gone on to engage in formal education. And it was, I thought, a lovely example of how starting to make learning relevant can have amazing effects on young people's lives. So I wanted to share that story with you. I thought it was a really good example of that notion of relevance in terms of curriculum. Another question that somebody asked was this whole issue that often when we start to talk about inclusion, we sometimes come down to talking about, are we all in mainstream schools or are we in special schools? And I think sometimes it's a bit of a pity that inclusion comes down to talking about location, because I think one of the things we're going to argue in this course is that inclusion is much more than simply location. Look, inclusion is about being included. It's not about where that happens, but it's about, in a sense, how that happens. How do we engage young people in learning? I have a colleague, a friend who works with young people who are disabled as a result of leprosy. And she was talking to them just not that long ago, actually, about this notion of inclusion. And the young people actually said to her, we're not so bothered about inclusion in terms of location, but we really want whatever education we get to be good quality. And we don't really mind where that happens, as long as it's good quality. And I thought that was really interesting. And quality is something that we will pick up on later in this course. What does it mean to be a good teacher? A great teacher, a teacher of quality. And so I think that question in relation to remaining in mainstream education, will it have a positive or a negative impact on education? Well, perhaps it depends on what happens in either mainstream or in special school as to whether it will have a positive or negative impact on education. So another issue there, quality, that we will return to and look at in more detail over the next couple of weeks. So thank you for that question too, because I think often inclusion comes down to mainstream or special. It's part of the discussion, but I don't think it should dominate the discussion. I think there are some deeper things that we need to think about in relation to inclusion. Another question, and I guess, education in a sense is a very political thing. Somebody was, one of my classes yesterday, somebody was talking about the fact that in their country they've had several education ministers in the last few months, and every time somebody comes in they say, well, I've got to make my mark, and so something changes. And so in a sense, education is a bit of a political football that gets kind of kicked about. but education, I think, does need to respond to political situations. And of course, one of the issues that Europe, and not just Europe, in fact, many countries in the world are dealing with just now is the whole thing around migration. Now, migration has two aspects. There's asylum seekers and refugees, for example, but there's also the notion of migration in terms of rural to urban. The population, the world population now, there are more people living in cities than are living in rural areas. And again, actually, these are issues that we pick up on later too. Does it matter where you live, in a big city or in the country? Does that have an impact on what happens to you? But the specific question that was posed on the Google Hangout page relates to responding to refugee students, especially during the current refugee crisis. How can educators and schools and education systems best respond to the needs of children in this position? It's a hugely important question, and one that I think governments need to think about, as well as schools and educators. And I think we would be suggesting that when we do think about working with students, refugee students, then it needs to be a whole kind of coordinated response. Education is one part of the response, but it's not just about education. There will be issues around housing, issues around health. So it's a whole lot of issues that we would have to, or groups rather, that we would have to work together with. But it does seem to me that there are important things as educators that we need to think about in relation to the culture from which refugee and migrant children and children of asylum seeker families have come from. We certainly need to be aware that where they have been coming from areas of turmoil and war and trauma, then we need to be incredibly sensitive to that. That's a really important thing we would need to think on as we're planning for learning for these young people. And we need to think about the culture. And for me, I think it probably comes down to something that actually I would be arguing is true for any young people we work with. We need to think about relationships. I think teaching and learning are hugely bound up around this idea of relationships, the kind of relationship that you create with young people. It's an interesting relationship, I think, that a teacher has with a young person. You want to be approachable. You want them to feel they can ask you things and ask you questions when they're stuck. But you know, you are a teacher still, and it's quite a difficult kind of balance sometimes to get that. We work hard with our student teachers here, for example, to try and get that balance between being approachable and a friend, but you know, you are still the teacher. So I think those are important things that we need to think about in relation to working with children who have come from backgrounds, different backgrounds from the country they now find themselves in. We of course know that many of the world's refugees are in fact within country or within continent. They've just moved to the country next door, and they haven't always made huge shifts because that's not always possible financially for them to do that. Perhaps that is another course all of its own, thinking about some of these issues. But I hope some of those thoughts have will perhaps be helpful as we're thinking about this. Another question that we've been asked was around the issue of how educators and schools and education systems, oh no, sorry, beg your pardon, that's the one we've just done. Let me go on to the next one, sorry. Somebody's saying here they have thousands of out-of-date textbooks and they're just going to be thrown in the bin over the summer. I would love for these to be used in other countries. Have you got any ideas if there's any charity that would collect these and transport them abroad? Now, abroad depends where you are. So I'm in Scotland, so I've got a thought in my head of where abroad is. If our first person that signed on is in Brazil, well, if you're in Brazil, abroad might be somewhere different for you. I think the question has come from somebody in the UK, and if it has, then there are certainly charities here in the UK. One that I know of would be Books Abroad, and they will often collect books and find a home for them. However, can I just give us all a word of caution there? we need to be careful about materials, because if you think about the question about curriculum, we were arguing it had to be relevant. One of our friends and our colleagues here, she might actually join us in one of the future Google Hangouts. Her mother worked in Malawi in Africa, and one day, she was a nurse, and one day the teacher came to the hospital and they said to her, I need to borrow you. Can you come to my classroom, please? And she kind of thought, what a strange request. And she said, yeah, okay, I'll come to your classroom. And she went to the classroom because they were reading a book that had been sent by a school in the UK. And the book was a story or a true story about Anne Frank, who had been, her family had been persecuted, and she had hidden in a house in Amsterdam during the Second World War. And in that book, Anna hides in the attic. And the young people sitting in Malawi, looking round at the architecture round about them, had no idea what an attic was. It was culturally just out with their understanding. And so our colleague's mother had to go and explain about what architecture looked like in the UK and in the Netherlands in particular for this story. And then they had a better understanding. And there is also a question of, if we feel the books are no longer relevant for us, well, are they relevant in other contexts? So I'm not saying we shouldn't share materials and resources, absolutely. And I think in the global north, we waste an incredible amount of things and stuff, for want of a better word, that could be put to use in other contexts and other places. But just a word of caution, we do need to be careful and make sure that they translate into other countries and other cultures and other contexts. Now, have some questions come in as we've been, or as I've been talking here online.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in here.
Okay.
First one from Saima from Pakistan. Could you tell us about disabled people's right to education? What facilities should be provided to them?
Yeah, well, the UN Convention on the Rights of Children with Disabilities, or people with disabilities, would certainly say that they do have rights. And I suppose one of the issues here, certainly in the global north, is that a long time ago, we didn't really consider that children and young people, or people for that matter, with disabilities were capable of learning. So we categorised children a long time ago here in the UK. We use words now that we just wouldn't use. Words like, we talked about them as being an imbecile. We said they were ineducable. In fact, it wasn't until 1976 here in the United Kingdom that we decided that actually everyone is capable of being educated to some degree, in some way. And prior to that, we didn't think that. And so I suppose one of the things, and again, we'll look at this when we come on to look in week 2 about architecture and how architecture can be a barrier. Can you just remind me the second part of the question, Kasia? So that
about facilities, what facilities should be provided? Yeah,
I mean, in some senses, it really does depend in relation to facilities. It will depend on what the disability is. And disability is a kind of a collective term that can cover a whole lot of things. So if we're talking about visual impairment, then my friend in Tanzania, for example, would be using Braille with young people. If we're talking about physical disability, then it may be that there's some kind of mobility issue, and therefore it might be looking at wheelchairs. It may be, I can think of a young person in my class who had what was it they had? A muscular dystrophy. So they had very kind of floppy muscles, and that's very difficult for pencil control. So it was about providing a kind of getting a pencil and then providing a kind of grip so that they didn't need to hold so tightly. And that simple thing, a pencil grip, helped them. There's also, of course, issues then around financing of that and whether those bits of equipment are there. I think too, people can be very ingenious in the way that they come up with things that help them round barriers, physical barriers. And I've certainly, when I was in Tanzania, saw some ways of people moving about that I just wouldn't have thought on here, but out of necessity they had kind of invented, if you like, almost a way of getting from A to B when they weren't supplied with a wheelchair. So it's quite a difficult one to answer in any kind of one way, but certainly we would be arguing that disability in and of itself is not a barrier and should not be a barrier to education and to having opportunity. Okay, do we have some more?
Yeah, we do. How can poor people get quality education in developing countries where dual education system exists?
I take it that question, we're talking about a dual education system. I'm going to interpret that. If you're still online, then if I'm not interpreting it correctly, please come back and tell us, and Kasia and Podria will let me know. But I'm assuming you're talking there perhaps about the kind of state-run education system, and alongside that maybe some kind of private education system. I think for me, the big issue is around the teacher and the quality of the teacher. The State of the World's Children report in 2013 talked about the teacher perhaps being the key, or one of the key elements anyway, in this notion of providing quality education. And therefore I think for me, thinking about education, even, and poverty of course is a relative thing, so we have poor children in Scotland as well. It may be different from other countries, but the kind of result of living in poverty is often the same. It reduces your chances, it reduces life chances, and I think for me education is one of the things that we need to use, if you like, to try and break down the barriers of poverty, to make sure that opportunity is not linked to how much money you have. That and part of that is about ensuring that we are providing quality education for young people, opportunities that are not dependent on the amount of money you have. I think also my knowledge of private education in some countries, private education doesn't always equal good education, and actually that's probably true across the globe, global north and global south. And again, we're back to that issue of, well, what happens in each of those institutions? I hope I've interpreted your dual system comment in the way that you intended.
We've got one more, a bit specific question from Teresa. As a Spanish teacher in Scotland, I find it difficult to engage my students. Okay, and there is like.
Is that one question?
Yeah,
yep.
It's still one question.
So
they are used to working just through grammar and not using the language as a tool for communication.
Okay.
What can I do to engage them in my lessons?
That's a good question. We're back to that idea of engagement again, that we discussed a little bit earlier. I suppose again, maybe for me it comes back to purpose. And if children have been used to learning a language in one way, then it perhaps will also take you a little bit of time to move them from learning in one way to get to learning in another way. It's probably not going to happen overnight. I can actually think about an adult example of this. I had asked a group of teachers to think about a time when they'd had to learn something. It could be a good experience or a bad experience of when they were learning something, and what had made it either good or bad. And I heard this person's voice get louder because they were getting very anxious, and she said, you know, I just hate everything to do with French, and her experience had been as a young person. She had been in one school in Scotland, and it had been very grammar book led learning around French, and she was good at it. She had learned the grammar well, she could write it well, and she thought she was really good at French. And then they moved house, and she went to a new school, and in the new school they weren't really learning grammar from a book, they were learning it through conversation. It was a very different way of learning French. And she had all this knowledge up here of French, where she'd been getting good marks in the previous school. And suddenly she couldn't translate it from up here to out of here. And she started to do very badly in French. And she was very bitter about it. And she actually had just completely disengaged from the language. So I suppose maybe one of my answers to that question, very specific question would be, and maybe it's a specific answer to that question, but maybe applies in other contexts, is that you can't change the kind of learning that young people do overnight. They will find that very uncomfortable. So there would be a kind of an incremental way of moving your learners forward, perhaps from that grammatical book-led way into a conversational way. And I guess making sure purpose is in there. I also know of a school in a city in Scotland, I'll not be any more specific than that, but a school in a city in Scotland that was situated next to a football stadium where they had international football players. Got some of the international football players in to talk to the young people and to talk about the importance of speaking more than one language and speaking it fluently. And according to the teacher that was telling me that story, the interest in the language shot up once the young people said, oh, there's these really famous footballers and they're only here because they can speak and they've learned all these languages, and suddenly the young people became really interested in learning a language. So I hope perhaps some of that those ideas are helpful to you. Kasia, you got more?
Got it from the US. As one who works with young people disengaged from schools, could the problem be with our understanding the difference between education and school? Can education only take place in a building?
Oh, in my view, no. Education and learning takes place everywhere. In fact, sometimes even more exciting stuff happens when you're not in school. And one of my disappointments, I suppose, about the Millennium Development Goals, and there was nothing wrong with the goal, you know, universal primary education for everyone. Pretty fantastic idea, I think. But then we went about it in a way that I'm not so sure was so helpful, because we tended, I think, to think on education and universal primary education being like school as we know it. In the kind of the global north and America, UK, etc. And I think sometimes that's been perhaps a mistake, that you're right, learning takes place in all kinds of places. And I think if you listen to Bonnie when she was talking about adult education and the impact of childhood experiences on adult learners, then I think we can see that learning is a much bigger thing than simply a building or a school, as we have kind of as we tend to think about school. We have very set ideas on what school is and what school isn't, and certainly in the global north, you know, most people, not everybody, but most people have been to school, and therefore they know about school and they have a view about school, and they're very definite about their view about school and what schools should do and shouldn't do and should be like and shouldn't be like. And I think perhaps if we think much more broadly in relation to education, and if we actually focus on learning, then I think we would perhaps break down some barriers that are out there too.
Thanks, Margaret. Another question. Hi, please mention ways of making ethnicity inclusive in education, breaking the barrier of language.
Well, actually, there's another online course coming up that's been developed in the University of Glasgow that's looking at that notion of language and the power of language. Language, I think, is a hugely powerful thing, and it can be actually a very, very exclusive thing. The course is called Multilingual Learning for a Globalized World. I feel hugely privileged that there's an awful lot of people in the world that speak English. Last week I was at a conference in Vienna and the main language there was English. It was easy for me. I actually have two colleagues sitting here beside me, and for them they both speak wonderful English, but it's not their first language. And so I'm going to ask them in a minute or two, give them time to think, if they would like to comment. And in actual fact, Podria's master's course, and her PhD is actually around this notion of English language learning, but kind of language learning more generally. But I think we use language to exclude. Now, sometimes that might be language as in English, French, Urdu, whatever the language is. But I think even within language, we can speak in a way that excludes. Here in Scotland, we have a lot of different accents and dialects. Somebody said, I think asked on our online course, oh, is Margaret's accent Scottish? And well, yes, it is. My mother was an elocution teacher, so she taught me to speak well. I hope she would be pleased if she's listening. But we have other dialects in Scotland, very strong dialects, where I can speak in that way, but if I did that, it might be likely you might not follow what I'm saying. So we can use language to exclude. Academic language, there's a whole set of jargon and words associated with things, and we can use that to exclude and to make something sound superior, and well, we've said this, but you didn't understand it. And so language is a hugely powerful tool. So I think if you're interested in that, I would suggest you maybe have a look and sign up for this other course that's being developed here in Glasgow. I'm going to stop speaking using language at the moment, and I'm going to hand over to both Kasia and Podria just for a comment about language. Ooh, can't even say it. Language and their thoughts.
I think yes, especially when you speak English. From which perspective? I think it's different when you speak English here in European countries. When we speak it in your country, for example, my country, Saudi Arabia, will have another perspective for the English language. So when you speak English language as a second language or a foreign language, that also affects the context, influenced by the context. So I think English will be more easier in my country than here, because in my country we use it only for school purposes, where here we use it for everything as a native or first language. And I think also it will be difficult for the kids here. For example, my daughter will face some difficulties when we come back for my country, because the English considered here as a first language, while we deal with the English as a foreign language in Saudi Arabia. So I think the English also not a language. I just speak the English because I'm just in the context of English language. But also the English deal with the culture, the behaviors, and a lot of things behind or under the language. So I think we need to consider all the things around the culture issue of the language, not only the language. So what about you, Cassia?
In my case, when I came to Scotland about 10 years ago, I feel I was the one who was excluding myself from the environment because I was terrified to speak to people. I was worried that people are not going to understand my accent. But actually everyone around was so helpful and very, very understanding about me being from Poland. So at some point I realized, okay, if people cannot understand my accent, they can just ask, and I'm willing to clarify. So I felt it was more my attitude that excluded me from the environment, not the other way around. So right now, frankly speaking, sometimes I'm on the street, and when I can hear like Scottish slang, sometimes I have no clue what's going on. And I think, oh my God, is it English or German? But right now, at least I've got the courage to say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand what's going on. Could you please clarify? And I think it's more about my own attitude. And it was more my behavior. With my behavior, I was excluding myself from the environment. I think right now it's much better. But yeah, language is a funny thing, because sometimes I keep thinking, do I have the same identity when I speak in Polish and when I use English? Is maybe sometimes my politeness lost in translation? Because, for example, in Polish, you can use intonation to make things sound nice. But here, if I say open the door without using the word please, it might sound a little bit rude. In Polish, you use the intonation. So sometimes it's a bit tricky, and as Badria mentioned, it's so many other things related to language, like culture. So
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'll let you into secret. One of my ambitions is to speak another language fluently. And when I'm speaking with Kasia, I'd like it to be Polish. When I'm speaking with Badria, I'd like it to be Arabic. When I'm speaking to my nephews and nieces who live in France, I'd like it to be French. So I kind of almost don't care what language. I would just love to be able to think and speak in another language fluently. So really interesting question. Thank you. We got some more.
Yeah, we do. Okay, there is a question about educational environment and how to include families and engage families to work with schools and children.
And families are hugely important. Parents are hugely important in a young person's life, and we would certainly argue that we have to work with parents, and we were talking about this yesterday in class, actually, that kind of tension where you want to do the best and it's in the child's best interests. But who decides what's best? You know, especially when the school environment has kind of one view of what should be happening, or maybe one view of where the child should be, and the parents have another. And I guess one of the things that helps us to work with parents is keeping the door of communication open. I think we need to sit down together. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes, as an educator, we have to be prepared to sit and really listen, and be prepared perhaps to change what we think, and certainly to explain why we think what we think. I can think of a couple of instances where my colleague and I were asked to go and speak with a parent of a child who there were issues and struggles with school, and we spoke to the school first. We arrived in the school. The meetings were going to happen in the school. So we arrived in the school and we sat and chatted to the school, and they told us, oh, we're doing this and we've tried this and we're trying this. And there was a really fairly comprehensive package of things that they were doing and in order to try and support the child in their learning. And we said, these are some really good things. Have you told the parents? And they said, no, not really. And so when the parents came in to see us and the school were not there, and the two parents came in and they said, well, yeah, they're doing nothing. And we said, well, actually, they're doing this, they're doing that. And they hadn't sat round the table and shared with each other what was happening. And meetings had tended to end up being quite defensive on both sides. And so I guess having us there almost as a kind of mediator, it helped them to really talk through what each were doing. And that actually changed things for the young person. And parents and schools generally want the same thing. They want the best for the child. School, though, has not just one child to think about. Sometimes the parents only have one child. Working with parents is a hugely important thing that we certainly have to do, but it's not at times unproblematic, and that's not due to the parents being a problem or indeed to school being a problem, but it's about when you get people together. Working together can actually be quite easy to say, but in practice quite hard to do. But I think there are skills that we can learn and share with each other. I think we're possibly coming near the end of our time. My big worry before we started was, oh my goodness, will we be able to talk and engage for a length of time? And I've certainly enjoyed our.
It's been amazing.
Yeah, your questions have been great, both the ones you posted beforehand and the ones that you've been posting as we've been on air here. We are really, really looking forward to working with you next week. Next week, we're set to look at the barriers. We've talked this week a lot about the kind of the legislation, the big ideas behind this idea of everybody learning and education for all and so on, but in the acknowledgement that there are some difficulties. We're not going to knock all the barriers down at once, but we can certainly start to dismantle them. And I think when we do that together, we're going to have more success. So we're really looking forward to seeing you. Thank you very, very much for joining us. We have now had our first experience of a Google Hangout, and we'll go away and think how we might do this either differently or better, or whether we'll just do the same. And we'd like to hear from you in that as well. We hope that you've enjoyed it as much as we all have here in Glasgow. So however much of the day is left for you, or whenever you're listening to this, we hope that whatever you're going on to do next, you have a good time, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in week 2. Thank you very, very much for spending time with us. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.